question there.
As an African person, not African American, every time I attend these conferences, we're all lumped in the same thing and we're talking about ethnicity. Where does the African population fall when the Center for Disease Control are doing these things? When they're doing HIV, you hear it's Africa and it's this and it's that. But when it comes to substance abuse and mental health, we don't know because we're lumped in and we only go for the things that they put Africa in as the leading cause, but with, you know.
And it's difficult, and I think that's, when I talk about what are some of the limitations of death certificate data, one of the limitations is with several of these groups, there's a lot of diversity there. You know, when you talk about Latinos, well, you know, you've got Cuban Americans, you've got Puerto Rican Americans, you've got Mexican Americans, you've got Latinos that come from Central and South America, you've got all of those groups. But because when you do it nationally, oftentimes you may have a really small number there. Statistically, it becomes almost impossible to do something with all of those different groups. You've got to try to put them all together to get some data. Now, what you've got to do is locally look at it, and that's where you can start to pull apart some of that information and see exactly where it falls. Actually, one of the other presenters here, Dr. Sean Joe, who's at the University of Michigan, has done some work at least separating out Caribbean African Americans from U.S. African Americans. So, you know, some of that work is being done, but because oftentimes you're talking about some small numbers, it becomes much more difficult statistically can do it. You can count them out and count out some numbers, but when you talk about is there a pattern here, oftentimes you don't have enough numbers to do a pattern because that population is such a small representation in the whole United States. It can be done, that's all I'm telling you. It can be done, it's just that usually with national statistics, we do a lot of lumping with a whole lot of folks.
When we focus on small cities, like you talk about Detroit, you know, Detroit is big, but you still won't get that information. You'll still get African American. And then, but when it's very negative, then Africa is pulled out as, you know, this thing. So I'm looking at if CDC is working and it's international as well and working with the World Health Organization, how can that kind of information look at in the different countries around the world and be, you know, compared to the United States in that way, you know, I think we'll get a fair representation.
You can definitely do some of that, but some of that is the requirement. I won't say the requirement. Some of that is the kind of the push from the local folks about we need data that's specific to our community. And that in that part, you know, oftentimes when you talk about national and international data, they just don't do it because it's much too difficult to try to pull out each individual group. But, you know, when you get back to, you know, Detroit and Wayne County, okay, now we can start to pull out some of those numbers and describe exactly what's going on with this population. So some of it is you might got to ask them. And you got to push them a little bit. You know, we need information that's for our neighborhood, that's for our community, that's for our precinct, that's for our census area, you know, for our, you know, our section of the city, so that we know exactly locally what the problem is, and it's not lumped into all of Michigan or all of Wayne County. You know, we want to try to push it. And so sometimes you got to ask that. Now, you know, sometimes depending upon what information is on a death certificate, sometimes it's not in there. And so it becomes impossible for them to do it. But oftentimes when you do things like surveys of health risk behavior, you can get that kind of information. But it is a push. Sometimes you got to push them to, you know, ask some additional questions so you get, you know, where was this person born and how do they identify themselves so that you can get that kind of stuff. Yes, here first and then there.
Real briefly then, what have you seen comparing the United States and other countries?
In regards to suicidal behavior, it sort of depends on which of these groups you're talking about. And overall, now overall the United States is probably not real high in regards to suicide. You know, there's some other countries, some Eastern European countries, Japan, China, that have much higher rates of suicide. Now when you talk about interpersonal violence, killing each other, yeah, you know, in the Olympics, we always root for, you know, we want to be number one. Unfortunately, with interpersonal violence, especially youth, yeah, we're number one with that. Suicide, we rank down a little bit lower, but still a problem. You know, it's still something that we need to address. But we're not ranking internationally as high as, you know, number one. We tend to be down, you know, maybe between 15 and 20, you know, in terms of overall international suicide rates.
Thank you.
Yes.
You know, locally, I was thinking about state by state. In Oklahoma, I don't know if you have it separate, but in Oklahoma you have the Native American, but you also have the mixed population of the Black American and Native American, the Freeman Indian. Have you, I mean, you know, a lot of people are not familiar with it. And I'm from Oklahoma, and I always felt when I came here kind of lumped in. No, like she does. You know, a lot of people are not familiar with us, you know, and they always, especially when it comes to alcohol, you know, they tend to lump us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's definitely true. And again, another thing that's, you know, kind of a limitation of what we collect on death certificates, you know, the Census Bureau up until, I think, the 1990 census, you had to identify as one thing.
Right.
It wasn't until the 1990 that they allowed you to put mixed, you know, in regards to heritage. So even just because of that factor, when we try to calculate rates, when you calculate a rate, you need a denominator. You need to know how many people are in that category, and then you know how many deaths were in that category to calculate what a rate. Well, if nobody ever asked about mixed race, then we don't have a denominator in order to calculate a rate. So part of that is a problem. And then even when you start talking about, you know, people who identify as, you know, multiple ancestry, what is that multiple ancestry? Is it American Indian, African American? Is it white African American? Is it white Latino? And so then calculating some of these numbers is a challenge. But you can do some of it. But it's still a matter of, are you collecting the information in several different areas so that now when I get it over here in terms of the population, and then when I get it over here in terms of the deaths, I can now, you know, put that fraction together and determine what that rate is. So yeah, it's definitely an issue. There was a question there, here, okay, there. And then I'll come back over that way.
I noticed on the information, there's not any data collected about the Arabic and the Middle Eastern community. And I don't know if everybody from here, I stay in Dearborn. I work with a lot of at-risk Arabic boys, and a couple of which have either attempted suicide or had very suicidal thoughts. And when I was doing my research in order to help them, I couldn't find hardly anything unless it was talking about the suicide bombings. And obviously that's not an issue because it's a 15-year-old 10th grader. So with this
So
being,
where is it? It's one of those lumped again. They would be in the Asian group. But Asian because Middle East, that's considered part of Asia. Anyway, but yeah, it's not very useful for what you're doing. And again, that's something that at the local level, nationally, while the Arab population might be pretty big, nationally, what percentage is it of the whole United States? It's pretty small. I mean, you're talking about, you know, less than 10% of the whole U.S. population. So oftentimes when we calculate rates, it's lumped in with others. But if you were doing something like a survey in Dearborn or in Wayne County, it would be something that you would specifically isolate so that you can talk about what is the risk in this population. So yeah, I'm absolutely agreeing with you. I bet there is limited information about that population. So again, it's something to kind of push for, you know, when they do something like, you know, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, that you specifically identify those that are of Arab descent or Middle Eastern descent so that you can start calculating. I mean, my father was principal at Pershing for a long time, a Chaldean population there, which is a Middle Eastern population. That's a big, I think it's like a quarter of the school at Pershing. You know, so again, it's a big population for which you want to get, right, you want to get that kind of information so that if I want to develop a program, it can be much more effective if you know what you're dealing with. So it is something that you got to do, but you've got to kind of push folks a little bit to try to collect some of that information, because oftentimes when you talk about at a national level, it just gets lumped in with everything else because of, you know, what we're trying to do with statistics. Now, you know that I haven't actually talked about the research project yet. That's okay. You're asking a question? That's cool. I just letting you know. I haven't even gotten to the actual project yet. What time is it? Hold it. Oh, it's 1:40, so I got about 50 minutes. 50 minutes. Let me go ahead. One question there, and then we'll go.
How, in comparison to the rest of the world, how common is suicide in sub-Saharan Africa?
Oh, you know, I don't know. There is some difficulty with collecting some information, and I'm just speaking specifically about death certificate information, because sometimes the infrastructure in certain nations is not very strong for how they collect death certificates, or it's very behind. I think in the United States, although for an industrialized or a more industrialized country, we are way behind because, like I said, we only got 2006 stuff. It's 2009. We're almost 2.5 years behind, whereas Japan, oftentimes they're only a few months behind. But in some of the sub-Saharan nations, they can be very much behind, but it has to do with the infrastructure that they have in public health, which is oftentimes vital statistics, where they collect death certificate information. So I don't know what their rates are. Some of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa have a much better infrastructure. I'm thinking Nigeria, South Africa, a few others, where you'd be able to compare to some of those countries, but there are other ones for which their government systems are not that good or are way behind. So I just don't know, exactly what the numbers are. Yes?
I want to ask you, a school system where you talk about coping strategies, self-soothing strategies, where that's actually practiced like from early school to kindergarten to first, all the way through.
Whoa.
Do you know of a system where that's like, where it's addressed first grades, early school, kindergarten, first, all the way through high school? Do you know of a system where that's addressed at every level?
I don't know of any. It doesn't mean there aren't any. I just don't know of any. You would have to think that for that to exist, that there would have to be kind of at the district level or at the superintendent level, a specific commitment to do that kind of thing throughout the schools. And having had a father that was a principal, principals kind of run their schools oftentimes within guidelines, but the way they want to. And so you would have to be able to convince all of the principals of all the elementary schools, of all the middle schools, or all the junior high schools, and all the senior high schools to do all of that in a district. And that you might be talking about several dozen schools to try to do that. So I'm thinking it would be difficult. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I'm thinking it would be difficult. And to have a consistent program across all of those different levels of school, again, now what you might do in elementary school probably wouldn't be called the same thing that you would do in the junior high or the senior high, but right, at age-appropriate level. And I'm thinking that would be a big challenge. And I don't know whether it exists or not, but I'm thinking it would be a big challenge.
How that could just smooth out a lot of things. I work with teen moms and I find out that we're not taught how to think in this country. I don't know if it's taught anywhere. We're not taught how to make conscious choices. Mm-hmm. And we're not taught how to make our dreams come true when all we have to do is address what makes us happy, basically, and go for it. We're not taught that. But, I was just at, and then the other question I have is this.
Wait.
I do have another question.
No, you got to hold one.
Okay.
I only let him ask one. You got to hold your one. All right, so we're going to actually get to what was this project that we actually did. Examine the association between alcohol and suicide among racial and ethnic groups. And I was sort of setting that up. This is just a description of the violent death reporting system. I already talked about that a little bit. But in showing you those rates and how the rates differed in the United States within each of those different populations, it sort of led us to say, when you talk about alcohol and suicide, pretty much most of the research says that alcohol and alcohol misuse is a risk factor for suicide, but does it apply evenly to all groups? Well, you guys could probably guess. There's probably going to be no. It doesn't apply evenly to all groups, but we're scientists. We got to test it out and make sure that it really is that. This is the data that we used from 2005 and 2006. We used 17 states, and you can look at the states there. At that point, Michigan was not in the system, so it's not included. But you can see the 17 states. It represented about a quarter of the U.S. population. All the other part is talking about is that it fit into international criteria for how you determine a suicide death. And then we also looked at not only the toxicology, but there are several questions in that data system that not only ask about, was alcohol detected in terms of a toxicology, a blood test, but was alcohol even suspected? And so we looked at a number of different variables. Was there a history of alcohol problems? So there's different questions that get at different levels of alcohol involvement. So we looked at some of those, and this was just to let you know that when we talked about intoxication, we used the general rule that Department of Transportation does for intoxication at the .08 level. Those are the 17 states that were in the system at the time. You can see there's not a real geographic pattern to it. Because this program, the Violent Death Reporting System, is actually a competitive program. So it's actually which states turn in the best applications in the year that we're looking for announcements. So you can see where those 17 states fall in regards to as of March. And actually I told you Michigan got in. Actually Michigan and, I hate to say it, Ohio got in this year. So those two states are now part of our system. These were our methods. We categorized it by age, by race, by ethnicity. We examined several variables related to alcohol, and we calculated some percentages for the groups based on the circumstances. And here are some of the results. Several different things here. When we looked at just alcohol use suspected, we can see that alcohol use was suspected in about a quarter of the deaths due to suicide. What was interesting about this is that some groups were suspected they used alcohol more than they actually got tested out to actually have alcohol.